Welcome to the Principles of Performance podcast, where we discuss how to optimize your health, fitness, and performance. Drawing on decades of experience of working as coaches, consultants, and trainers to top performers, athletes, and teens from professional sports to top universities to the U.S. military, Eric DeGatti and Mike Perry discuss topics and strategies of how to perform at your highest level and be your very best. Join us and our friends and colleagues who are leaders in the fitness and performance industry as we investigate and challenge the most popular training, nutrition, lifestyle, and recovery protocols. And away we go. Here we are with the Principles of Performance podcast. We are at episode number 31. I'm your host, Eric DeGatti, along with my buddy and co-host, Mike Perry. Mike, welcome to the show today.
It's good to see you, buddy. It's a beautiful day here in Boston. We're going to hit about 42 degrees. So, it's everyone's getting the shorts out and getting ready for summer.
Sun's out, guns out, buddy. All right. So speaking of which, we're going to talk a lot about resistance training, even get a little bit into hypertrophy and that stuff. We're going to go from a little different angle today. We're going to talk about research, and we're going to talk about what we know versus what's kind of bro science out there, and where the two may match up and where the two are completely opposite. And if we're going to talk research, we're lucky to have somebody from one of the best research labs in the country for this. And that's Max Coleman. And Max Coleman's a second-year master's student currently working under the legendary Dr. Schoenfeld at the Human Performance and Fitness Lab at Lehman College in the Boogie Down Bronx in New York. If you're not familiar with Dr. Schoenfeld, his lab is considered one of the premier research centers in exercise science and published over 250 peer-reviewed scientific papers on various exercise and sports nutrition related topics. And Max's research interest pertains specifically to the manipulation of resistance training variables and their effect on muscle hypertrophy. So Max, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. And let's talk about some of the things that we know, some of the things that we don't. Mike, I'll let you kick things off.
All right. So, Dr. Schoenfeld's work is considered some of the most respected research and content in the fitness industry. How did you become part of his lab?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this on the last podcast I went on, Logan Harrelly's podcast, which is great if you guys haven't seen it. But I've been into lifting since I was about 12 years old, so I'm 24 now. And just like most Gen Z kids, the first place that I went to learn more about the thing I was interested in was YouTube. So very quickly on YouTube, you're exposed to two different facets of fitness. You're exposed to the six-pack shortcuts. I don't know if you guys remember him very much from back in 2010. And you're exposed to kind of the evidence-based side. And I got to give a big shout out to Omar Isuf, because he was the first person to ever mention Brad Schoenfeld in my world. And that kind of just got the ball rolling. And then it was kind of just this ancillary interest I had growing up. I was just into lifting and kind of finding the most optimal way to elicit some sort of hypertrophic response. But it was just a hobby. And I was kind of lost, not lost. I hate to say that word to make it sound so existential, but I was not interested in making a career out of it. And I was in nursing for a little while and kind of realized that wasn't for me. So my dad was like, well, why don't you try exercise science out? You seem to really like that stuff. So switched majors. And then within the first 10 minutes of my 8 a.m. exercise physiology class, I was like, yeah, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. And then fortunately, I was down at Auburn University. So I'm from Alabama, even though I am currently in the Boogie Down Bronx. But I was fortunate enough to work with Dr. Mike Roberts. And him and Dr. Schoenfeld are actually good friends. And he got me in contact with him, and Doc and I kind of hit it off from there. And then lo and behold, so yeah, it's about a 12-year journey now, and I'm very happy to be where I am right now.
Awesome. It's got to be a very cool place. And so one of the questions that comes in my head when we talk about research, the first guest we had on was ironically my brother, and we had him on to specifically talk about research. Now he's a DPT as well as a PhD in physical therapy, but he's done a lot of research. We want to kind of dig in a little bit more. And one of the things that always stuck out from our conversation was research basically starts with a question, right? You have to pose a question, and then your deal is to answer what you think is going to happen and whether that's right or wrong. And so describe a little bit about some of the core beliefs, or maybe it's a mission statement or something that you would have in your lab, and is more of the goal to try to prove what we think we know, or disprove it, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, so I would even not to disagree with your brother, who I've never met, obviously, but I would say research, even before you have a question, you have to make an observation, right? So the observation is the absolute first thing, and for me, that observation was, look at all these jacked people, and then the question was, how are they getting so jacked, essentially. But that was just a little side tangent. As far as the core mission statement of Dr. Schoenfeld's lab, so I'd like to iterate Dr. Schoenfeld's lab, not my lab, unfortunately. I'm just a lucky master student who happens to be working in it. But I wish I could give you guys some cool, grandiose answer for what our mission statement is. But truth be told, the mission statement of Dr. Schoenfeld's lab, and I'm kind of speaking for him here, is just trying our best to conduct and to disseminate as much quality research as we can pertaining to getting jacked as possible. I mean, that's really what it boils down to, as non-fancy as it sounds. And as far as disproving or proving previously held beliefs, I think that's kind of a researcher dependent question. So for instance, I think it goes both ways, right? So right now, my thesis I'm conducting is about detraining and deload periods. So my opinion, my hypothesis is that detraining and deloading is probably really good for long-term strength and muscular adaptations, right? So in this particular instance, yes, I'm trying to prove something that is a belief that I already have. However, more so than that, it is simply the desire to find new information, because that's what research is at the end of the day, is creating new information that has not been done before. So I think that if you tailor your research, philosophy towards disproving or especially proving previous held beliefs, that's when you can allow for a lot of biases to be infiltrate their way into your research. So unfortunately, I can't give you a good straight answer, but I would say it goes both ways as far as trying to prove what we know and disprove what we don't know.
So what are some of the things that you've learned about strength and about hypertrophy that goes against some of the sort of common and long-held beliefs?
So full disclosure to the audience, I hope this is allowed, but you guys did give me these questions beforehand, fortunately. And this one stumped me a lot. And the reason being is because, like I said, I've been in this lifting circle kind of thing since I was about 12 years old. And I got really into the evidence-based, science-based side of it when I was about, I'd say 18. And then another shout out to Omar Isaf, because he had Dr. Mike Israetel on his channel. And that was my first real exposure to like the mixing of the evidence and the practical application of what we study, right? And that exposure at kind of a young age has led to a almost cut offness from the real world in a way, because the majority of the time I spend online or in person, really, I'm hanging out with like-minded individuals who are also really into the science of lifting. So I don't get to see a lot of the common held bro beliefs, because I don't even train in a normal gym anymore. I train in our lab at Lehman. So I don't get to hear a lot of those conversations about, gotta go to failure, bro, or whatever it may be, gotta get your, can't eat your nightshades like Tom Brady. I don't think he doesn't eat tomatoes or something like that. But I'm not exposed to a lot of those ideas, right?
Easy with the Tom Brady stuff. We have a Boston guy in there.
Sorry.
Mike doesn't get sunburned because he drinks water, just like TB12 told him.
It's accurate.
Yeah. So I will say the one thing that I've tried really hard to come to terms with, and things that I've learned both anecdotally and through the research over the last couple of years, is kind of pushing away from the mentality of go hard or go home and more is better. I would think that those are probably the most prevailing ideas that persist even amongst evidence-based individuals of, you got to train the muscle to failure, bro, or you got to be smashing it 7 days a week, bro, like things like that. So an idea that, and even like us, like we're gym bros at the end of the day. Maybe we study it, but we're still just gym bros, and we have those little things in the back of our head saying you're not pushing hard enough or you're not doing enough. And being able to really turn that noise down and think, no, there's a limit to how much I can recover from, and there's probably an optimal amount that's less than what I want to do, if that makes sense. So I long-winded, but basically pushing away from the more is better and go hard, go home mentality is probably what I've tried embracing the most over the last couple of years.
Well, I will tell you that I think you're profiling a little bit with the gym bro thing, even though I can recite every single line of pumping iron backwards and forward. And so that being said, so much, if you look in the history of weight training from, that era to where it's gained its popularity today, a lot of biases are in bodybuilding. And so now we have a very different demographic that we're dealing with that's walking into Mike's facility that are adults that are over 40, that are women, that are people that weren't part of that culture initially and that weren't there in gyms when I first started going, 30 years ago. And so when you talk about we want to build muscle, we want to gain strength, there's huge benefits to that are aside from the aesthetics and bodybuilding and that sort of thing. So is it safe to say that new population needs almost a different prescription than the typical bro splits body part type of training?
So I would say that regardless of the population, right, whether you're 46, right, or 16 and just getting into lifting, or 46 and just getting into lifting, right, the prescription remains largely the same of what we're going to do, depending on the goal of the individual. So if a 46-year-old comes to me and they say, I want to get as jacked as possible, their training program is likely going to look fairly similar to that of a 16-year-old who comes to me and says, I just want to get as jacked as possible. Now, the practicality of that question is the most 46-year-old clients aren't coming to me saying, I want to get as jacked as possible, right? They're saying, I would like my daily activities of living to be a little bit easier. I'd like to, kind of prolong this game we call life. And I would just like to be, live a healthier lifestyle. And that, when it comes to that, the same thing goes for the 16-year-old. Like if they said that, the training would look a lot different. I would not be smashing them with like body part splits 6 days a week, 2-a-days or anything like that. It would be much less intense as far as true volume and then the actual grit of the program. But as far as treating these clients very differently, I would say I try to avoid that because at the end of the day, we're all human. And though our physiology does change as we get older, we still largely respond to resistance training similarly. So for a long time, it was believed that individuals over 40 or 50 there was no reason for them to go to the gym. There was nothing that could be done. I taught about this in a class, the class that I taught last semester, which is like an introductory course to exercise science. We had a class where we just devoted it to disproving myths. And a lot of very long held prevailing myth was that lifting over the age of 50 was pointless. And fortunately, Dr. Schoenfeld recently wrote, not super recently, but within the last 5 years, wrote a meta-analysis assessing the effects of hypertrophy training or resistance training on very old individuals, geriatric individuals over 70 years old. And they saw massive gains in strength and hypertrophy in those individuals. So once again, long-winded, sorry, I keep going off on tangents here, but do I think that I should treat a 46-year-old soccer mom who just wants to get, in shape for summer the same as a 16-year-old who's trying to get jacked as possible? Absolutely not. But I am going to treat a 46-year-old soccer mom who wants to get as jacked as possible the same as a 16-year-old kid who wants to get as jacked as possible.
Yeah, and don't be shy about going on tangents. That's what this whole show is. And so there's, if we have time, I want to get into where anybody could really benefit from and really needs muscle, a certain amount of muscle. And even we can get into, when we talk about myths, is that, when that person comes and says, well, oh no, I don't want to get too big. First thing I explain to them and say, look, I've spent the last 25 years trying to get too big. I wish it happened by accident. Right. But let's talk about actually how that does happen. Like in the simplest terms, talk to me like a kindergartner. What are some of those key mechanisms that create muscle growth and hypertrophy? And what then are some of the elements that need to be part of that training program to make those mechanisms trigger?
Yeah. So first I got to acknowledge, I'm sorry, I have to acknowledge I'm scared of getting too bulky. I've been lifting pretty hard for 12 years and I still have people ask me if I lift weights. So I would give anything to accidentally stumble into too much muscle mass. So I definitely trying to discourage anyone who's fearful of that. As far as the basic fundamentals necessary to design a training program for muscle growth, it's just not that complicated. And so inherently, it's like talking to a kindergartner when you're describing this stuff. Well, okay, not really, but without trying to complicate things, I'm stealing this truthfully directly from Dr. Israel's scientific principles of hypertrophy training, right? In which the first 3 chapters are specificity, overload, and fatigue management. And they basically say after that, those 3 chapters, they're like, if you have these 3 things, you have a really solid, good training program. And there's like 7 chapters in the book. There's 4 more chapters of things that on top of it will make it a better program. But those 3 are fundamentally what you need. And that is specificity, right? Which is, I know that kind of in our ivory tower of fitness, you guys, like said, you've been in this for a while. We forget that there are a lot of people who think that running is really good for muscle growth in their legs, right? And it is up until a point, but it's only going to keep you as jacked as you need to be to continue running, which, let's face it, is not that jacked. So I think that the biggest thing, obviously, is specificity. You need that guidance system pointing you in the direction of the goal that you want, right? And then the next big thing is overload, right? Things need to get harder and harder. And then finally, like I said, fatigue management. And I'm going to break these down to make them more kindergarten, like you said. And then you need fatigue management, which is just as we train, we accrue these wonderful things like more muscle mass, more strength, but we also accrue these other things like increased, stress hormone levels, difficult. Like if you train too hard, obviously, without this fatigue management component, you can lead to overtraining, which affects your sleep, affects your ability to continue inducing these muscular adaptations, right? Now, even more simple than that, what do you need to design a very simple, straightforward training program? You need to expose the muscle groups that you want to grow to some degree of resistance training in the 5 to 30 rep range, right? And you should hopefully be doing that about twice a week per muscle, which means you can be training as little as twice a week full body, right? And more importantly, or equally as important, is next week has to be a little bit harder than this week, whether it be shorter rest periods, increased load, increased reps, increased sets, whatever it may be. And the week after has to be harder, and the week after has to be harder. And then eventually it's going to be so hard that you're going to need to take a little bit of time away from it, meaning like a very short period of time, like a week for a deload in this instance, and then keep building, and then you start over essentially, not from step 1, but from step 5. You start over from step right before you took your little break. You keep going, you keep pushing it. I know that's not the simplest terms in the world, but that's about as simple as I can put it. You got to be training in the 5 to 30 rep range about twice a week per muscle, and things have to get harder over time.
Interesting. So it seems like, a big part of this is just the effort component, right? Because obviously, you can design these really, really in-depth programs, but if the effort is not there and you're not putting in that effort week to week, maybe the program doesn't matter too much. And I think what we always talk about one of our courses is I'd rather see someone do a simple program well than a complicated program that they can't finish or that is just not optimal for people. But I think effort is always that missing link, especially when it comes to hypertrophy.
Oh, I mean, so Dr. Schoenfeld, okay, well, first of all, anyone agrees with you. I think that the proximity to failure, relative intensity are probably the single most important acute variable when it comes to any type of progress in the gym, right? You can be, so like a lot of people are always asking what's more important, volume or intensity. I don't know if you guys have heard that. There was a big question in like 2018 that it was prevailing, and it's died down a little bit now, but you can do 30 sets a week per muscle group with 10 RIR, which is 10 reps away from failure, and see almost no adaptations whatsoever at all. So that's actually something Dr. Schoenfeld and I have talked about a lot, which is that if your goal is to grow as much muscle in a single session as possible. Obviously is a complete hyperbole, but you should be training to failure. You should be absolutely smashing the muscle, whatever it may be. Now, obviously, longitudinally speaking, chronically speaking, that's not what we suggest, but I couldn't agree more that effort is probably the single most important variable when it comes to any of this stuff. So yeah, definitely in agreement there.
So there's countless training methods that we can leverage to increase intensity and or volume. And you recently published a meta-analysis on drop sets. Tell us how that study was designed, and what did you find that could have a practical application in our workouts?
Oh, good question. Okay, so that study, so that drop set meta-analysis that we ran was actually part of a course here at Lehman College. So in Dr. Schoenfeld's master's program, you can take an elective course in which the whole class just conducts a meta-analysis. Coolest class I've ever taken in my entire life, I gotta say, and it ends up getting you published in Mass, which is, I mean, there's nothing cooler than that. But anyway, so the way that we designed the study is that everyone in the class came up with ideas for what we thought would be a cool meta-analysis, and then obviously none of them were as good as Brad's, so we used Brad's for the drop sets. And then we just did the typical meta-analysis thing. We went and looked through a bunch of different databases. I think we used Sports Discus, PubMed, Google Scholar, and I believe another one. And tried to find as many studies as we could that fit our inclusion criteria, right? Which is just studies that are directly comparing traditional training methods to drop set training methods, right? And we found about we found about 7 that were good, but only 5 of them directly met our inclusion criteria. So we met 5 studies, and we found that there was no difference in the amount of hypertrophy or strength increases that we saw, very small effect sizes at least, that we saw between conditions, right? Which is to say simply that we found no difference between drop sets and traditional normal strength or resistance training, right? But we did find that a couple of the studies noted much shorter training periods in the drop set groups, which is to suggest that those training with drop sets, we're seeing the exact same amount of increases in both strength and hypertrophy, but in a much shorter period of time. Which suggests that drop set training may be a really efficient way of training for individuals. Now, there's a bunch of caveats to that Mike Zordos did a wonderful job analyzing it in his mass review that I'm going to touch on here. But my biggest practical takeaway for just the average listener, not the people like me who weirdly devoted their entire life to this stuff, this weird hobby, is that if you are someone who's interested in getting bigger and stronger, and you are very pressed for time in the gym, drop sets might be a wonderful option for you. Now, that being said, if you are a freak like the 3 of us who took this hobby to the nines, essentially, I don't think that doing drop sets chronically for a long period of time are very wise, especially for strength training adaptations. So even though we didn't find a huge difference statistically speaking, a huge difference between the strength outcomes across all 5 studies, they leaned far towards traditional training being better for strength. So the reason I say that is because one of the studies that we analyzed, I believe it was Fink et al. It was done by Fink et al. And it looked at 12 RM tricep strength, which we didn't include in our study because it didn't technically meet our inclusion criteria, which is like strength has to be in like the 1 to 3 to 5 rep range essentially. And they showed significantly higher increases in strength in the tricep group that did traditional sets opposed to drop sets, right? And then we had another study as well that showed significantly more strength increases than in the traditional group than the drop set group, because they were training with much higher loads than those in the drop set group. But the other studies showed very similar increases, and I think that's largely due to the rep ranges that were being performed by those individuals, right? So they were comparing like 12 to 15 reps with 20 to 30 reps in the drop set group, for instance. And so you're obviously not going to see huge differences there. But I think that once you start training above that 85%, you're going to see significant. I mean, as we know, you need to train heavy to get strong, obviously. And they just simply weren't comparing heavy training to drop set training. They were comparing hypertrophy style training. So like 10 to 15 rep range with drop set training. So once again, long-winded, but I think that drop sets are a great option for casual lifters who are just looking to get a little bit jacked and a little bit strong, just, normal people. And then if you're more obsessed, it's probably not something to do chronically for a long period of time. But I do think it is a wonderful thing to throw in at the end of a workout, at the end of the last set of an exercise, to really quickly and effectively increase the amount of volume that you're doing. And then, not to mention, you get a sick, gnarly pump from doing drop sets too. So, and like you said at the beginning, Mike, there are a lot of different ways of doing it. There is nothing magical about drop sets whatsoever. They are simply a way of, they're a pump exercise. They're a way of accruing metabolites in the muscle that you're training. So you can do things like pre-exhaust supersets to the same effect, most likely. You can do things like BFR training, so blood flow restriction training, for those of you who don't know, probably to the same effect. And myo reps and rest pause sets and stuff like that too. So biggest takeaway again, there are a bunch of efficient ways of increasing your volume. So just find the ones that you like. I personally love drop sets. I think they're really fun. I think running the rack with a bunch of bicep curls going from the 40s to the 10s is like one of the most fun things on the planet. So yeah, find what works for you, I guess, is my biggest takeaway there.
Love it. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here. And this is simply because of the individuals that I work with. So I work with kind of two different populations. Most people, part of them are post-rehab coming out of physical therapy. And I work with a lot of professional fighters, mixed martial artists, combat athletes. And one of the questions that I had is, so when we're doing this high volume kind of hypertrophy training where you're really getting that pump, there's also a muscular endurance component. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people are understanding about when you're training for hypertrophy, is you're getting your body also acclimated to basically withstand more volume, and sort of it has to manage metabolic waste. So have you guys seen any research or talked about how maybe some of the hypertrophy work that you've been doing, or some of the research that you're doing, is going to affect localized muscular endurance, and how that could be potentially beneficial for other athletes?
So I gotta say, like right off the bat, the second we start talking about something other than just getting jacked, truthfully, I mean, this is the nature of the world we live in now. It's about as hyper specialized as it can be. But the second we start talking about like athletics and other sports, I want it to be clear to your audience, I'm outside of my realm of expertise here, okay? But do I think that hypertrophy training is beneficial for almost every population? Essentially, yes, I do. And I know that I'm obviously biased given everything that I've already said, but I do think that strength is, I think Mark Bell, I don't know if he's the first person that said strength is never a weakness, essentially. And I could say the same about, obviously, I mean, you're a combat, I'm assuming you are involved in combat sports as well. If you're interested, there is a point where you can get too jacked and it becomes a problem. So obviously it's not a linear relationship. But I do think that hypertrophy training is probably very beneficial to a lot of athletes for the reasons you were just saying. Yes, there is a muscular endurance component. I can't speak directly to that like super in depth, but I can say, for instance, that it's something that we test for. So in my thesis, we are currently testing to see different muscular endurance outcomes between groups, between deloading and not deloading, right? And then in the study that I was a part of last year, my good friend Daniel Plotkin, shout out, he's now at Auburn doing his PhD, but his thesis was on progressive overload without progressing load. So increasing the amount of reps you were doing week to week, or increasing the amount of weight you were doing week to week within a fine rep range, right? And they found that there was I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, if not, I'm so sorry, Daniel, and to the rest of the community, but I do believe that they did see a higher increase in the muscular endurance test in the individuals that were increasing reps to reps each week. Now, I don't think it was super, it wasn't incredibly significant. It wasn't like a drastic difference or anything like that, but absolutely. I mean, you train in if you're, smart, you're probably training in the 5 to 30 at the most rep range. And there's just, I mean, no question, no one's doing squats, but if you're doing leg presses for 30 reps, yeah, your quads are getting a pretty impressive and incredible and robust endurance exposure there that I think will lead to some pretty incredible adaptations over time.
Very cool.
Hey, everybody, a quick break in the action here. Hope you're enjoying the show and we appreciate you listening. We're working hard to bring you the highest quality content and best guests every single week. So if you could do us a big favor and go and like and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you get your podcasts on, it would be greatly appreciated. Be sure to listen at the end of the show also to find out where you can find out more information about our courses, as well as a special discount code for all our listeners. Thanks again, and let's get back to the show. So as you're talking, I got a bunch of questions that are kind of going through my head, and one of them was actually, and I'm wondering if it's the same research that I came across, was where they took a group and they basically said, okay, let's say you could lift for easy numbers, you could lift 100 pounds for 10 reps. Now, as for your progressive overload, you can either add weight to the bar and go from 100 to 105 and 110, or you just keep doing more reps. Instead of doing 8, now you're going to do 9, then you do 10. And they both had similar results, except for kind of what you'd expect. Like you said, they had more muscular endurance in the higher rep group, or more strength in the higher intensity group. But their results in terms of hypertrophy was relatively the same, I believe. And I don't know if that's the same study that we're talking about.
It is the same study we're talking about. Yeah, absolutely. And I actually would like to note that I don't think that I could be wrong once again, because I haven't looked at the manuscript in a minute, but I do not think that there was a significant increase in strength in the load group. I think that there was pretty equal strength increases even, which was surprising.
Yeah. And so there's that kind of gets to the next thing I'm thinking about, is there's a lot of different ways to create that overload. But then my question is, okay, when you're looking at some of these papers, specifically like with the drop sets, we have all these different ways between drop sets and cluster sets and rest pause and things like that, where we can create more intensity. But I would imagine that that's going to be somewhat specific to the population that you're working with. And so like when Mike and I talk about program design, we have to teach trainers and coaches that understand that if you're working with general pop type of clients, that the vast majority of them just need good general physical preparation, just need good GPP. They don't need a lot of these kind of bells and whistles tricks. That's once you've kind of get, a little bit more training age under your belt, where you kind of need to kind of go to that toolbox to create new adaptations. So did you see across any of these studies, whether it's drop sets or anything else like that, where it was specific to kind of that training age, or how experienced these lifters were?
So I did do so in meta-analyses, sometimes you do something called sub-analyzing, which is where you have this initial question, right? Are drop sets better than traditional sets, right? And then you find a bunch of information, then you start noticing some trends, right? We're like, oh wow, it seems like this study had trained individuals and they seem to be responding a lot better than this study that had untrained individuals, or this study was on females, and so then you do things like, oh, let's sub-analyze, see if it had a different effect for females, trained athletes, different musculature. That's all to say that we couldn't do any of that, unfortunately, because it was such a small study. So our meta-analysis only looked at about 5 studies, which I would say is about the bare minimum that you should do a meta-analysis on. So we weren't able to do anything like that. So I can't say specific to populations if they worked better for males than females, if it worked better for your upper body musculature than your lower body musculature. I can't say if it worked better for geriatric individuals versus like combat athletes or anything like that. But what I can say is even more specific. So getting out of the population and going into the individual, drop sets hurt, man. Like they are painful. And like some people, some freaks, some masochists like myself enjoy that, that burning sensation, but most people don't. And I don't remember exactly which study it was, but one of our studies in that meta-analysis did note a higher session RPE. So they found the sessions to be harder in the drop set group on average than they did in the traditional group, right? So I do think that not only is it, yes, population specific. So like I probably wouldn't have a bodybuilder or a power lifter year round doing drop sets by any means, right? Whereas I would probably much more likely have a bodybuilder doing drop sets more commonly than a power lifter, right? But certainly there are individual differences and oftentimes we talk about cost benefit in this industry. We talk about, what's the cost benefit of doing drop sets? Well, the benefit is you get more time. The cost is seemingly maybe no cost if the adaptations are the same by our meta-analysis standards, right? However, the cost that people don't often talk about is pain and enjoyment. Some people, the cost benefit ratio for drop sets is so bad because drop sets are just excruciating. They dread them, they're miserable, and that obviously will interfere with adherence. So unfortunately, I'm not answering your direct question of, do I think drop sets are better for certain populations, or did I notice different things across populations? But I can say that individually, yes, there are huge differences in the way that people perceive any type of training, obviously, but specific to drop sets here.
It should also be noted that one of the most painful things in a drop set is to your ego. If someone walks in and sees you struggling with the tens in your hand,
yeah,
and you have to explain, no, I've done 50 reps up until now.
Sure you did, buddy. Yeah.
Now it comes to, it kind of reminded me of some other research I want to get back to in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about your thesis first, and where you're talking about the effects of a deload period and taking some time off, and the adaptations to strength and hypertrophy. And so I want to hear a little bit about that, and I want to come back and see if it might have dispelled some myths that are out there. So let's just kind of first talk about the foundation of the thesis itself.
So for sure, I unfortunately can't speak to whether or not if it's disproven anything, because we are literally in the middle of data collection. So I can't speak to at all to the benefits of a deload as far as this study is concerned yet. But I can talk about the idea and the origin of the idea. So I believe the first person I ever heard discuss deloading was probably Dr. Mike Israetel, either via YouTube or what have you. And that was probably around 2019, 2018, somewhere around there. And then all of a sudden, man, I don't know about if you guys have noticed this, but deloading has picked up a lot of traction within the evidence-based circles. There's been a lot more talk about it on social media and on YouTube, and even within the scientific community. And there's a lot of theoretical rationale as to why these deloads might be really beneficial for training adaptations. So that was kind of the initial idea. And then I started looking into it, and I was like, wow, there's no one's looking at this. Why has no one done a longitudinal study looking at this directly? And there's been a couple kind of looking at this area. So there's a bunch of studies. There's two studies by Ogasawa et al. I'm sure I'm butchering that name. I'm so sorry if you happen to be watching this podcast. But he had untrained individuals train for 6 months, and he had one group train for 6 months, and then he had one group train for 6 weeks, took 3 weeks off, 6 weeks, took 3 weeks off, right? And that gave us some really cool insights into not having to be afraid of detraining, because they saw similar increases in strength and hypertrophy across both groups, even though they were doing in the detraining group, they were training 75% as much as the continuously training group, right? So that gave us some cool insights into, we don't necessarily have to be afraid of losing all of our muscular adaptations in a short detraining period, right? But there are a couple issues with those studies even, right? So for instance, they used untrained subjects. I don't know a lot of untrained subjects who really need to be deloading every 6 weeks, if I'm being wholeheartedly honest with you. And then also they were detraining for 3 weeks. And now I don't think that taking 3 weeks off the gym is this horrible, immoral thing. And if you do it, you're not a true gym bro. But there's not a lot of people out there taking 3 weeks off the gym. So it didn't really lend itself well to real world settings, right? So the impetus for this was seeing what research kind of already had been done on the area, and then tweaking it a little bit to make it a little bit more what we call ecologically valid, which is to say more applicable to real world situations. So that was the impetus for the idea.
So another legendary exercise scientist, Tudor Bompa, had a famous expression, soon ripe, soon rotten. And basically the concept is the longer your training age, the less of an effect you will have from downtime than as opposed to someone. So if you had two people that are in the same theoretical level of fitness, and one trained for 5 months versus one for 5 years, the one who trained for 5 years will have much less of a detraining effect. Have you found that to kind of be the case in what you've seen so far?
So, man, tangent real quick. Let's break down what you just said, which is that one person's been training for 5 months and one person's been training for 5 years, and they are at the same exact level of fitness characteristic, right? Now, that's unfortunate for the 5-year individual, but let's say that they stop training. I do think that 5-year individual, theoretically, I don't have a lot of research to back this, will likely hold on to those adaptations a lot longer than the 5-month individual, right? Now, in this particular instance, it doesn't matter because the 5-month individual takes 5 months off. He comes back and he sees faster adaptations than the 5-year individual will, regardless. But in a real world application, yes, I think it's likely that, and we just see this across other things. So, like for instance, like if we're, and I'm stealing this from Dr. Israel again, but like let's say you're learning a new language, right? And let's say, Mike, you seem to be a wonderful English speaker, probably your first language, if I had to guess. Let's say that you went to Spain and you did not speak English to anyone for, let's say, a year, right? You didn't speak English for a year. Let's say that, Mike, in this hypothetical, you're also a fluent Spanish speaker. I have no idea if that's true. And you come back a year later, and I mean, how hard do you really think it would be for you to pick back up speaking English? Like, it's something that you've been doing for decades, I'm assuming, right? Now, take that exact same scenario, Eric. Let's say that you're not a native English speaker and you've been practicing English for, let's say, a year or two, and you're pretty conversational, you're pretty good at it, right? But you go back to your home country, Spain, in this made-up scenario, and you go away for a year and you don't speak English and you come back. How hard is it going to be for you to come back speaking as good English as you did when you were, practicing for 2 years straight? So I think it does, it does make it, it passes the face validity test where it's just like, you know what, that makes sense when you just say it out loud. Unfortunately, there are some theoretical reasons as well. Like we do have the myonuclear domain theory, which is also losing some credence now, but I won't go off on that tangent. But there are some reasons to believe, yes, I'm really sorry. I didn't know this Tudor Vampa guy until you sent me this. I feel bad and ignorant. So if he's watching, I am sorry, but I do believe there is credence to the soon ripe, soon rotten notion for sure.
Now, so, I'm sorry, what you just mentioned, I've heard Andrew Huberman talk about as well, as and talking about, for lack of better terms, that's actually muscle memory. That if you've had that, training experience, even if it was some part of your life, and now you're far removed from that, you'll have a much better training result coming back than versus someone who's never had that experience from a physiological standpoint. Is that kind of what that's referring to?
So that lot to unpack there. Sorry. So I was kind of going through the levels. First of all, muscle memory is very different from what I'm assuming Dr. Huberman was talking about in this particular instance, because muscle memory is more of like a motor learning thing where you have these informational stores in your neurons that kind of, it's like what Mike, sorry, I keep using you as an example. Eric, I know more about Mike, even though I've known him for a shorter period of time. I'm sorry. But Mike, you're a combat guy. So like, I'm assuming that you get in some, I'm not a combat guy, so you get in some rear chokehold or something. There are probably some instances in where you do something and you did not think to do that because it was almost instinctual. That I think is much more so muscle memory. And here's a fun little thing for the listeners. Muscle memory is a bit of a misnomer because there's no memory. Your muscles don't have brains that store information for like, motor patterns or anything like that. All of that information is stored in the neuron telling that muscle what to do. Now, to get to the actual question at hand, which was, is that kind of what Dr. Huberman was talking about? Yes. I think
and that's what I was referring to. He's talking about how it's somewhat not anything to the, even though he's a neuroscientist, it was not about the neuro, because we know that that's kind of not the case. We know about motor programming and motor learning and that sort of stuff. Taking that off the table, I'm talking about more specifically from the coding within the cell, that someone who's got that history within there embedded, that's more easily triggered when that training starts to happen again at any point later in life.
Yes. So I mean, once again, face value, I think, yes, it's very likely that is the case because of things like the myonuclear domain theory, right? But there's also some ancillary theories or other theories, that cursory theories, I'll even call them, that I've come up with that I've never tested these. I don't think these have ever been tested, but I think there's a lot of reasons why you see people who go away from the gym and come back and see probably faster results than someone starting out for the first time. One of those being obviously the myonuclear domain theory, right? Now we're getting into muscle physiology, a little bit outside of my realm, and I'm sure that someone in the comments will tell me how stupid I am for personifying cells like this. But basically, as we train to get bigger, right, your muscles are like a construction site, and each nucleus inside of a muscle is like a manager telling those muscles what to do at different times, right? And then eventually your construction site, your muscle gets so big that These, these contractors outside of the cell come in and say, hey, here's another manager, and they donate their nuclei to your muscle, right? And then they operate in that domain, right? And the theory holds, right, that once that satellite cell donates, once that contractor donates that nuclei to the muscle, you don't lose it. It doesn't go anywhere. You don't lose it even if you stop training. Your muscle might get smaller, but that number of nuclei you have stays the same, right? And so that's one reason why we think that individuals who come back from training, because they already have all of those nuclei in there, they're much more primed for growth. Now, like I said, I kind of alluded to this a second ago, there is some evidence suggesting that that theory, that myonuclear domain theory, might not be what we once thought, because I'm blanking on the name, unfortunately, but there was a study recently done where they analyzed detraining in older individuals. And they actually saw an initial uptick in the number of myonuclei, right, after a certain number of weeks of training. And then they had them stop training, and then they tested them again. And they actually did see a decrease in the number of myonuclei in the muscle. So that theory is obviously losing a little bit of its credence. Now, I don't think one study certainly suggests that it's not a thing. We were definitely wrong. But I think that certainly there are other reasons as well why individuals might see faster rates of growth. And this is so silly, but these are like my cursory theories. Those I'm out. One, there's a component of self-efficacy there, right? So literally just coming back to it, knowing that they're capable of something, it's way easier to execute. I'm sure you guys have gone through weight loss diets before. The second time is easier. The third time is easier. The fourth time is easier. So doing things like knowing that you're capable of something makes it a lot easier to accomplish, right? And then two, these individuals coming back to the gym probably have a much more vast knowledge of how to train correctly. They probably have a much more well-developed mind-muscle connection. They also have found over the years things that already worked for them, even after, back then, that probably still work for them when they come back to the gym, right? So I think that once again, if gun to my head, yes, I think that it's true that there probably is faster adaptation seen in individuals coming back from training rather than staying away from training. But unfortunately, just off the top of my head, I can't point to science that definitely supports that claim.
Well, so I just wanted to add one thing. So we're talking about, the sports scientist Tudabampa, and now a lot of the research that was done in, sports science in Soviet Union was not based off of hypertrophy. It was actually more of like, we're talking about sort of speed, power, glycolytic training, glycolytic power, glycolytic capacity. Mm-hmm. And they did come up with this sort of idea of what they call training residuals of training modalities. And, but all that research was done on elite athletes, right? Because obviously, when you're working with those elite athletes, you can get more granular with your information because you already have a base level of training, and there's just a little bit less variability because you kind of know what you're working with because you have individuals that are already trained. So I think, like you were talking about earlier, like when you say it out loud, it needs to make sense. It's like, well, yeah, if someone has done something before for a certain amount of period of time and they've been exposed to that, if they do it again, it's probably going to come back a little bit quicker, right? And mm-hmm. I think that's just a big part of it is understanding sort of the training age, but also a lot of the research or on a lot of the old research on sports science was done on high level athletes. So it's people aren't really, like you said, people aren't really doing a ton of research on deconditioned individuals. Yes, it's starting to happen, but if you look at all the sports science stuff from back in the day, it's all on elite people because that was their control group. They could put them in a cabin and they could tell them what to eat, sleep, and they could basically oversee and tell them what to do on a daily basis.
Yeah, having a totalitarian government makes exercise science research really easy. Yeah, I kind of love the country I live in. Don't get me wrong, but sometimes I wish I could just have a little building where I keep thousands of people and I can just run studies on them to see how I can get them as jacked as possible. That's a joke. It's a joke for anyone who doesn't know that that's a joke. Okay.
All right. So I got two questions on the deload thing. One, I'm gonna go on two opposite ends of the spectrum. So before I geek out on some of the stuff that you triggered some thoughts with before, I'm gonna go like bro science guy at the deli conversation who says, well, if you work out and you stop working out, all your muscle turns into fat. Like, explain why that's ridiculous.
So yeah, I mean, if I heard, so I've had a lot of conversations with Dr. Schoenfeld and Dr. Israetel about how to broach conversations like that, where someone says something that demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're talking about, right? So like, for instance, someone asking what's better, rice or pasta, right? I would say
Pasta.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a rice fan myself, but to each their own. I don't want to offend any Italians or anything, but
oh, you get an Italian on the, you get Degatti over here. He's actually got surprised. He's probably got some pasta in his pockets right now. He's gonna have a little snack once we're off.
Yeah, I love pasta too. Don't get me wrong. I love a nice carbonara. Don't get me wrong. But
you've already dug anyway. That hole. It's too late, Max.
So the way to broach that conversation is difficult, right? Because you never want to come at it in like a didactic way where you're kind of like I'm in this ivory tower of research and you clearly know nothing, right? So in that instance, I would say I would probably take him, I try to meet him somewhere. I could try to meet him got to find common ground eventually, right? So I would probably say something like, oh, you're clearly into lifting. Like what bodybuilders, what powerlifters, whatever are you interested in? And they'd probably be like, oh, the big guys. I'm into I'm in all the big lifters like Max Coleman, Jacob. I don't know. I'm not really into bodybuilding, unfortunately. So I can't name. I'm into C-Bum or whatever it may be, right? And I'd say, oh, well, C-Bum, Dan Green, all those wonderful, very high level athletes, they take time away from the gym. Like, and what do you think about that? Like, why do you think they would be doing it? And then you kind of say, oh, I didn't know they were doing that or something like that. And you kind of meet them where they are. And then as far as the muscle turning into a fat thing, I think I would maybe make a dig. I wouldn't be able to help myself and say, like, I don't know why people aren't afraid that their brain cells are just constantly turning into liver cells in their head. But for some reason, we're terrified that our muscle cells are going to randomly convert into fat cells, even though they are completely different things. So I would probably say something like that as well. But truthfully, I would try to meet him halfway and say, like, look, I totally understand, man. Like, I love the gym too. I certainly hate taking time away from it. And I know that I feel kind of shitty when I go back to the gym after taking time off. But I think that there are a lot of high level athletes doing it. I think we have a good bit of research suggesting that it's maybe not a bad thing. And I would probably try and move him in that direction, suggesting that time away from the gym is not inherently negative.
Okay,
so and almost probably positive as well. Sorry, but yeah, let's nerd out now.
Let's go on the deload side, because one of the ways I've seen it popularized kind of in my world and working with athletes is through Jim Wendler's 5-3-1 system. And so if you read his book, there are programmed deload weeks within that system. And unfortunately, that system has been kind of copied and bastardized and stolen. And kind of like the telephone game, it gets lost a little bit, where he puts in that deload week with kind of an asterisk to say, deload, but it kind of depends, right? That if you're still seeing numbers go up, if you're still seeing gains, you can kind of blow right past that. And then once you get through the next cycle, you can add that in if necessary. So how case dependent is it, and how dependent is it on what the goal is as to whether you decide to deload? That's my first part of the question. Second part of the question is kind of clarify deloading as you're talking about backing off volume, you're talking about backing off intensity, you're talking about like Netflix and chill.
Okay, a lot of good stuff there. So let's actually start with the second part, which was what is a deload? Because I think getting an operational definition here is important before we start talking about who needs it, right? So what is a deload? Sadly, I can't give you an answer. So right now, I'm actually currently working with some researchers outside of England, out at Sheffield University, and Dr. Pack, I don't know, and so Lee Bell, Dr. Pack, shout out to you guys. We're actually currently working on a study to create a definition for deloads, because as we've talked about, they're pretty popular. I mean, like Jim Wendler's been talking about them for clearly a long time. So there obviously have been circulating people. Athletes have been tapering for decades and a millennia probably. But as far as what there actually are, or is that a reduction in volume? Is it a reduction in intensity? Do you do a lot more cardio on your deload? Whatever it may be. Are you just sitting on the couch and eating popcorn the entire time, right? We don't have a legitimate definition for that in the scientific literature as of right now, but we're working towards it. Now, that being said, let me give you what I think a deload is. Sorry, once again, long-winded. I think a deload is a short period, about 1 week, where you see large reductions in volume and intensity, right? So not only are we bringing the number of sets that we're doing down, we're also bringing the proximity to failure that we're doing down as well. So I think those are kind of the two big components. And not everyone agrees. Like my good friend Daniel Plotkin I just talked about, I'm pretty sure he brings volume down very drastically, but actually keeps training relatively hard. And I think that works really, really well for him. I, on the other hand, being the lazy, sloth that I am, my deloads are me doing nothing, me getting to focus on research a little bit harder, me getting to focus on classwork a little bit harder for one every 5-6 weeks, right? So there's certainly not a universal way by which people actually do deloads, but the methodology or the idea behind them is all about the same, which is a period of time in which you are potentiating future adaptations in your subsequent mesocycle, your subsequent cycle of training, right? So you train really hard. Eventually, you accrue so much fatigue that you need to take some time off because you literally can't train anymore. And then you take that time off, you let that fatigue dissipate. And fortunately, we know that those muscular adaptations aren't going to go anywhere either because they hold on for a lot longer than we think. And then you get back to it with all this fatigue gone, and now you can start from square one. Now, that kind of leads me into who needs them, right? I kind of alluded to this earlier, saying that I don't know a lot of completely untrained individuals who need to be deloading every 5 to 6 weeks, right? Solely because I probably wouldn't be pushing untrained individuals anywhere hard enough to where they would accrue a significant amount of fatigue, right? Now, that becomes a much more nuanced conversation when you start talking about like more intermediates and advanced, because some people deload every 3 weeks. Some people deload once every 3-4 months. So it really depends. But I think that performance decrements, like you brought up earlier, are certainly a good metric by which we know we need a deload. Now, unfortunately, I don't know if, now this is just, we're officially getting into completely, my ideas and my opinions. I don't know if performance detriments are the best metric to go by, because if you're seeing performance detriments week to week, you're clearly in need of a deload, and you probably needed one the week before you started seeing performance detriments, right? So one of my favorite metrics that I use, once again, this is just me, anecdotal, I'm not speaking as a scientist here, I'm speaking as just someone who likes to lift, is my desire to train. If I love training more than the next guy, I really do, and I'm sure you guys do as well. Unless the next guy is either one of you, obviously, then I love it as much as the next guy. But if I find myself like not wanting to go to the gym, it's very likely that I'm in need of a deload. Now, that's for me. Now, many individuals never want to go to the gym, and they just have to kind of like force themselves to. So that's not a good metric for those individuals, obviously, and maybe performance detriments would be a much better proxy for them. I think that also just general feelings in the gym. So are you going to the gym and are you feeling, for 4 weeks, you've been feeling these bent rows hit your rhomboids and lats like crazy. You've been getting this great mind muscle connection. And week 5 and 6, you start noticing, I'm still improving. I'm still getting better, but I'm starting to feel this more in my lumbar spine than in my lats, right? Or more in my rotator cuff than in my lats. I think that might also be a somewhat decent metric to use for individuals that are less inclined to love training, for instance. So I know that I just vomited all over you guys with words, but that's my general opinion of what the definition is and who needs it, I suppose.
Yeah, I want to just sneak in one more thing that I put a side note on earlier, and we were kind of talking about intent and intensity. I always remember I was in at a conference and speaking to legendary researchers. William Kramer was there speaking, and he was talking about some research we were trying to do on, I think it was endocrine effects of doing something like a German volume training. Like I think it was 10 sets of 10 with 60-second rest periods. And he said they couldn't get clean data because they couldn't get anybody to finish the protocol. Like he said, they literally had like a garbage pail that people were puking in, they couldn't finish it. So how much of is it hard to really get clean data when intent is something that's hard to really gauge in terms of how much effort someone's actually putting into something?
So I mean, absolutely. Like, so IRB, so we call it in America, I think we call it IRB, which is like your internal review board. And then in Europe, they call it the ethics board. They're basically your ethics board. You have to say, hey, I want to do this research idea. Because a bunch of scientists in the 70s and 50s fucked it up for us. And they were given a bunch of like schizophrenics acid and stuff. So we developed these things to keep scientists from being the evil scientists that they are. So fortunately, internal review boards and ethics boards don't typically aren't usually lifters, so they don't know that like doing German volume training is this like insane, miserable, cruel, and unusual punishment, right? But so fortunately we can get those proven. Fortunately, we have a decent bit of overtraining literature, and you're absolutely right. Like, it is hard to get. I mean, you have to get some psychopaths to come to your gym to do German volume training 3 times a week, people who just truly are masochistic and love the grit of training. So yeah, I do think that it is really hard to get very clean data pertaining to anything when it comes to like overtraining literature. So for instance, right now, I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about this, but right now in my deload study, we got garbage bins around constantly because because we wanted to ensure that these people were going to need a deload. So we're putting them through the ringer. And yeah, sometimes they're Western, we try our very best to stick to the exact protocol. I mean, we try to be as robotic as possible, but if I've got a kid who's like sitting hands and knees, like throwing up after his 4th set, I can't say, all right, man, come on, 5th set, time to go, let's go. It's like, there's only so much you can do, right? So yeah, once you start getting to where it becomes oppressive, I'll call it, yeah, it's hard to get like very clean robotic data as if we were just carrying out like a zeros and ones survey or something like that. So yeah, absolutely. And that kind of goes with anything in research, always be skeptical, look at it with a grain of salt, make sure you really read over the methods and see how it went. So yeah, definitely.
Well, this has been some awesome stuff. And so before we wrap up, Mike, I'll let you kind of chime in with any last thoughts or questions you may have before we shut it down here.
No, I mean, thank you so much for your insight and sharing your experience. As someone I've been more on the sort of sports performance side, and obviously I've done a little bit of hypertrophy work, but the guys that you're talking about, Dr. Mike Israel, Dr. Schoenfeld, like these are the guys. Those are the people that I send everybody to when it comes to hypertrophy. And a lot of the stuff that you're saying definitely resonates with sort of the beliefs that I've had as well. So thank you so much for, sharing your expertise with us, and I'll let Eric close us out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're looking forward to see what happens when you get all this information together in your thesis, and maybe we'll circle back and get you back on. You can explain what you find, but want to thank you for your time and your expertise and sharing all that information with us. And before we wrap up, tell us kind of what you got going on for 2023, and other than the thesis, any other new exciting projects or papers you're working on?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, actually, absolutely. Thank you guys. This was obviously a huge pleasure. Anytime I get to talk about lifting, I'm happy to do so. So I'll happily come on after we get our data nice and secured and published and stuff. So, if we get our data published and stuff. But as far as what I've got coming up, my sole focus right now is obviously my master's thesis and getting that done, which is about deloads, obviously. But I'm also currently on, like I said, working with those guys out in Sheffield on creating an actual taxonomy for deloads. That's really exciting. As far as what I've got coming up in the next year, man, for the first time in my life, I have no clue. So I got to graduate from this master's program, and then the goal is obviously a PhD. But as far as where that's going to be and what I'm going to be studying, I'm not sure. I just surely hope that it has to do with getting as jacked as possible. But again, thank you guys so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And that is a very worthy goal that more people should aspire to. And so thank you again, Max. And thank you everyone out there for listening. And this has been the Principles of Performance podcast. Thank you for listening to the Principles of Performance podcast. If you've enjoyed our content, please like and share on your social media outlets, as well as subscribe and give us a review on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your preferred platform is to listen to. For more information on the Principles of Program Design courses and workshops, visit us at www.principlesofprogramdesign.com and follow us on all of the social media channels where we post new content every day. To save 10% on any PPD courses, enter the discount code PRINCIPLESPODCAST10 at checkout. If you have any questions we can answer or suggestions for the show, you can email us at info@principlesofprogramdesign.com or message us on social media. Thank you again for your support.